If you are as nosy as I am, and you like to eavesdrop on target workers' walkie-talkies as they go off, then you may notice that they don't use terminology and words that you might know. For example, there might be acronyms like SFS, like ship from the store, or PML for a maintenance person. Some even sounds like personality types, like INFS, which just means it got kicked out of the SFS orders. But beyond acronyms, there are terms like soft line, which is meant for any place that has carpet within them. And instead of calling each other's managers and employers and employees, they call each other teammates and team members and team leaders. So why go through the trouble of creating a specialized lingo? I mean, it's convenient with the acronyms, that's for sure. But with team leaders and team members, why? It just seems like a extra work, a bit of a unique practice that Target specifically enforces. Why? The answer is simple. Culture. Target is trying to create a culture that is both productive and nice to work with. So here we have an example of an organization enforcing linguistic practices, and they're not the only entities to do so. We have schools, social media, our friends, other sorts of businesses, and religions trying to enforce what kind of words we use. But not every entity is successful. So what factors go into a successful linguistic culture? What words tend to be adopted, and by who? Who is the biggest influencer of language? Is it an organization top-down approach, or is it just one specific individual at the bottom that changes how a linguistic culture works? And do these individuals stick with the linguistic practices long after their association with said entity? Thankfully, there is one case study that's very deep and personal to me that I want to share with the rest of you. I graduated high school in 2018, and I didn't want to go to college, so instead I did a gap year program. It is a unificationist program designed to teach unificationist principles and to essentially create a stronger life of faith for those participating in it. So I joined a program, Generation Peace Academy, GPA for short, and I was with this program for one entire year. And so what was unique about this program was that, one, it had kids or people all over the nation coming to join in. Two, it was a religious organization, so there was lots of terminology that had to do with religiosity used within that place. And three, it was a program that had a heavy emphasis on fundraising. Everybody fundraised. That was our job. That was what we did most of the time in that program. And we fundraised for various reasons. We fundraised for service work. We fundraised to support the program, to make it self-sustaining. We would develop our life of faith at the same time. So to describe what kind of schedule we had every day, most of the time we lived in a van. A van consisted of one leader, whom we called a captain, with about 2, 3, or 4 fundraisers assigned to that captain, and that captain would report to a commander. So it's very hierarchical, and you can kind of tell by the words that we use that this is going for a more militaristic feel. This isn't just a handy-dandy retreat, reflect on life. No, this is gonna be a struggle buggle. We were gonna do outrageous things, and that we did. We would fundraise every day for a good amount of time, and by fundraising, as in we would go to businesses, walk around. We didn't just set up shop, we would actively go, travel, and meet people to sell things with. So we were essentially traveling salesmen for an entire year. That was what the program was like. One other aspect that's very unique about GPA was that it takes place during an academic year. And those, if you want to do more than 1 year, you can become a second year. You essentially climb up the hierarchy, and you can do 3 years, and then you can join staff after 3 years. And so what you can find is a continuous linguistic practice, because some people stay there for quite a while. There are some concepts that don't have a word for them in the English language. Concepts like the day after tomorrow. There might be a word for it, but it's not commonly used. But you get what I mean. And we call those holes in the English language lexical gaps. And when you're on Generation Peace Academy, you come across a lot of concepts and a lot of differing experiences that the English language simply does not have the words that you can use easily. So throughout the year, or throughout the years, we have found ways to fill those lexical gaps with certain words that we've used. And so I sent out a survey, and about 49 people completed the survey, alumni from Generation Peace Academy, and they gave me the list of words they used specific to that program. And it was fun to look through because there were some differences and there was a lot that stayed the same. And from all that I looked through, all the words that I've seen that people made, essentially there were 3 main categories those words fall under. One, it had to do with the business aspect of the program. The second is the social aspect of the program, how our peers influence each other. And lastly, the third major factor that plays into this linguistic culture is the religion. And what makes it even more complicated is that many of those things intersect with each other and spawn out new forms of words. So let's go through some of the most commonly used words and see where they fall. So starting with the specific words that we use for the business side of GPA, the first word is run. And the word run isn't used typically. It essentially has its roots from a drug run, where you go out to get a product. For us, we go out to sell a product. Not selling drugs, but you get where the word came from. Next, we have blitzing. Blitz essentially means to go fundraising at nighttime. That's what blitz means. And the origins of the word blitz is from the German word Blitzkrieg, which means lightning warfare, which is the battle strategy of Adolf Hitler. Next, we got... Hi, this is Ricky from editing, and I feel like that clip requires some context. So blitzing, fundraising at night, was a very high energy. They made us really pumped up for it. And I guess the word blitzkrieg captures that sort of energy. So that's why we used the word. I hope that makes it seem better. Next, we got denoms. Denoms is essentially short for denominations. We used it for counting money. What is your denom? It's more of a bookkeeping thing, and since everybody was involved in bookkeeping, we just, instead of saying the whole word, we just said denoms. And this is an example of a clipping, which is a shortening of an already existing word, which was denominator. So that is, there's specific ways words are formed, and this way is called clipping. The next word is PK, which is short for parking lot. And that formation is called an alphabetism. It's different than acronyms, because acronyms, you use the first letter of each word, but you actually pronounce it as a word itself. But for alphabetism, you simply just say the first letters. So PK, we don't say PK, we say PK, and that is alphabetism. And now we're going into the peer influences territory. And here we have hand sand. which is short for hand sanitizer. And this is an example of a blend where we take two existing words, shorten it, and combine it together. Next is we have PT, which is short for paper towels, and DGK, which is short for Dirty Ghetto Kid, just stating that you're not going to clean yourself up at the end of the day. So you're just going to say, I'm gonna DGK. DGK was a lot more popular in the older days of GPA. So it wasn't really in use by the time I did GPA, but it has a very universal, practical meaning that I'm kind of surprised it's still not in use today. There's certain words, I'm going to list them together: jaunt, inner, schwavi, brolic. These are all words, they mean different things. They're essentially like shorthands of just saying something simple. Why I want to put those things together is because there are certain words. Hi, this is Ricky, and I was editing it, and I realized I did not describe those words well. Essentially, what makes these four words special is that they are slang words, but they have different geographical origins. But on this program, all of them were present. And it was because we had participants all over the nation working together. And so different slangs from different geographical locations were put into the vocabulary of a GPA participant, despite their geographical origins. So I thought that was interesting to point out. So we're going into kind of a combination of the business and the peer influences and see what words come out of there. And for one, we have the word crusher. And crusher basically means someone who makes a lot of money. Someone who crushed out is, oh, you crushed out today, you made a lot of money. And that was used by the organization. And then there's the opposite, which means scrub, which means you sucked at fundraising and you didn't make a lot of money. The organization stopped trying to use the word scrub, but that word has persisted. It still exists in some form. So I personally was the biggest scrub of my year. I wasn't that great at fundraising. So that's my personal connection to the word. I really scrubbed out. Another blend is something called tofuna. Tofuna is a type of food, and I'm sure you can guess which two foods are involved in the making of tofuna. And tofuna is an example of what you call a blend, where you take two different words and you put them together. Another word is spacing out. This one is essentially when you just don't fundraise and you just stare off in the distance, or you do something else, or you think of something else to do. So with that, we're going into the religious side of the lexicon. This one is Cain and Abel. So Cain and Abel, they're used to describe people, or they're used to describe certain situations. Basically, Cain means less godlike and more secular, and Abel just means more ideal or closer to God. So they've been used to describe people. You can say, oh, he's a more of a Cain type, or oh, he's much more Abel type, and you can kind of get the gist of how we're labeling people in that sense. So that terminology relies on knowing the background information of such words, and that formation by itself is called back formation. So another word from the religion is autistic, and it is a derivation, which is basically adding a prefix or suffix to an already existing word. So unificationism is heavily influenced by Korea. And so the closest thing we have to a liturgical language, kind of like Latin to the Catholics, is Korean. And so a lot of Korean phrases are used religiously. And so they've been used in functions for the business as well. So this is a correlation of the business and the religion itself. The popular ones is kapsida, which is Korean for let's go. So when you're starting something, you head out and go. And there's something also called 잘먹겠습니다, which is more of it's just what you say before you eat. But something fascinating here. is that most of the participants, or a good deal of the participants of GPA, are Japanese descendants. And the Japanese, they have their own saying before you eat, and it's called ikitakimasu. The thing is, while that has been used more in the past, in recent years it's been falling out of favor, and the organization encourages us to use 잘먹겠습니다, which is the Korean equivalent. So Japanese as a language has been discouraged from being used because not everybody knows Japanese, and Japanese is not the liturgical language of the church. One example of how the Korean language has been encouraged but the Japanese language has not been is through the use of honorific. Korean and Japanese language are very hierarchical. It makes it very clear where in the social hierarchy you are at, by how you should address people. So we are encouraged to call out captains hyung, nunas, unis, or oppas. The role that honorifics play is that it makes it very clear how the hierarchy is formed, and it's very conforming in that aspect. It sounds really bad to a Western audience, but to most other cultures it's kind of normal. But that there's a certain way you address your elders, and this is one way to do it. And it's also a way to instill order and obedience, because it's very difficult to insult someone if you're also calling them your big sister. It's just a bit difficult. However, in the beginning, I did try to use the Japanese equivalent, which is ni-chan, ne-chan, but that was quickly shut down. But despite that, there are some Japanese phrases that does slip through. For example, desu ne, which is essentially asking for affirmation or confirmation. So right, correct, desu ne. But then there's also something. One way Japanese sneaks through is how we address the police. So because we do sell walking around like salesmen, people do call the police on us, and we have a nickname for the police, and different nicknames, but they have a similar trend. It is Popo-chan, Poli-chan, Polipo-chan. They all end in chans, which is a Japanese honorific for something very endearing. So you can see it's used sarcastically, because obviously we don't want to get any run-ins with the police, but that's how it's used. So from here we're going to go into the religion and business intersection. So divisions. The theological component of it is dividing the good and evil, and people use it as kind of like a scolding. When someone scolds you, maybe you're not making enough money, or you spaced out and your captain divides you. Basically, he scolds you. So we have another case of alphabetism, which is ODU, which is short for Origin Division Union, which is a theological concept. However, it is used as a business fundraising tactic for very different reasons. Basically, you start at the certain point, you separate, you fundraise, and you gather back together. That's what it means. Theologically, it means something else, but it's a theological term that's used as a fundraising strategy. Now we're going into the intersection of peer and relations. I could only find one, and that is the term called mansei. Now, mansei is a celebratory shout in Korea. The best equivalent I can find is hurrah or banzai from Japanese. But unlike hurrah, banzai and mansei are used more ritualistically. People actually say it. Before we leave, we say mansei. We say mansei as good luck. And there's also, we say mansei also has a theological component to it that means to be restored. And so we make something called mansei piles, which is basically a lost and found pile. And when you take something out the mansei pile, you manseied it, which theologically means you restored something, you saved it. You saved a coat from being lost forever, and so you found it. So that's mansei. It starts off with it is a Korean word with and it can have a theological meaning to it, and it has been mixed and transformed by ordinary kids, and it has just continued. It's just continued on that route. So there was only one terminology that I found that intersects business, religion, and peer relations, and that is caned out. It comes from the name cane, which I've explained earlier, and it's very similar to spaced out, but now it has a stronger theological meaning to it. Caned out basically means you stop trying. You stop trying to fundraise, and you stop trying to be a better person, and you just gave up. And it's used like, oh, I just got caned out. Like, oh, he said this, I caned out at that. You just got taken over, You just let your emotions get the better of you. It's kind of like a state of being. That's what it is. That's the only one that I believe intersects religion, business, and peer influences. Something that I've neglected to mention in my survey was that about 24 people, so roughly a little under 50% of the participants who took my survey, they weren't people who did GPA. They did a very similar program, but with one key difference, and it was that they didn't do it in the Americas. They did it in Europe. So let's talk about that. Everything else is still functionally the same. We're still dealing with the same religion. We're still dealing with an organization that mostly functions the same. And we're dealing with a same demographic of people, which is youths from America, all over the nation, heading over to Europe to fundraise there. So we're dealing with essentially the same control group. It's the same demographics of people. But instead of the United States, the experiences happened in Europe. And exactly what happened and what changed? Out of all who went to Europe, over 70% of them have mentioned coming back to the United States speaking in some sort of accent, from Germany or from Britain. However, some of them mentioned that they came back speaking an accent and they couldn't really find the origin of one accent. It wasn't easily dissectable into a certain European accent. And of course, linguistically, it was mostly the same. Most of them still used the term crusher. So there were some differences. The word scrub, most of them haven't heard of before. But the most common word that was used was blitz. Blitzing was used a lot. And I kind of find it a bit funny because the Blitzkrieg mostly happened in Europe too. So I guess it makes sense. Not really. Regardless, I just felt like since that was such a big portion of my survey takers were those who went to Europe, I had to explain some sort of differences. There wasn't as many, which leads me to conclude that you will adopt an accent of a land if you live there long enough. So it's kind of fascinating. Those who took my surveys were native English speakers, but they did the program not with native English speakers, but with people from Europe, and so they spoke different sorts of languages. So that's another aspect and variable that is different than the regular GPA, but functionally the organization is mostly the same. So I just thought I'll put that in there because that is a weird linguistic phenomenon that occurred. Something that I've noticed, and many other people have noticed too, is that many people who are on the program of GPA, there is a high inflection at the end of their sentences. So, sort of like they're always asking a question, despite their statement not being a question. So, like, I want a donut? That's also a way of saying California Valley Girl inflection as well. So, I had a question about the survey, talking about if they've noticed people talking with a high inflection. Roughly about 60% have specifically mentioned hearing an inflection from other people, but not necessarily themselves. In fact, the oldest participant who took it mentioned how she did not notice any high inflection in her year, and she did 3 years. Therefore, the person who influenced the program to use a high inflection happened after her year, and after her year was about 2011. That was when she left, which makes sense because the next oldest person to infer a inflection happened in 2012, which means subject 0 of the high inflection, if you will, occurred in 2012. If we are to go with the theory that one person can linguistically influence an entire linguistic culture within an organization. And that's the beginning of how people speak with a high inflection. And there's another theory that the oldest person who took the survey was simply wrong and didn't recognize the high inflection within themselves. And what happened is that those whose job it is to sell things used to ending their sentences with a question. Thus, just by the very nature of the organization and how they make money, they end things with a high inflection. One piece of data to influence this is that those who went to Europe, they've noticed that the English speakers do end with a high inflection, which can seem to suggest that the very mode of selling something influences the way a person speaks. So if you did GPA before 2012 and you know any information regarding the high inflection, please let me know, because I have invested countless hours into this and I want to know the truth. Thank you. So while I was editing, I found that I ended a lot of sentences with a high inflection. So just in case you missed it, this is how many times I've ended a sentence with a high inflection in this video. Yep. So after spending a whole year living in a van, speaking to the same sort of people every single day, or spending 2 or 3 years in that same sort of environment, you might think that there might be some struggle getting back into regular life. You might adopt some lingo that stays with you for a long, long while. But in the survey of 49 participants, each one detailing about their own journey about returning back to their linguistic norms of their American culture, they find that it was rather easy to drop what linguistic tendencies they had entirely. However, there were some noticeable exceptions. About 65% of the people who took the survey have mentioned that the only time it pops up is whenever they're talking to the same friends from their own gap year program. Another aspect is that 20% of people say that there was still an aspect of the language that they still carry to this day. And they specifically mentioned the Korean aspects of the organization is what gets carried over. They still use 잘 먹겠습니다, Jew, and if they are still part of the religion, then they uphold those fairly high. Some of them drop it, some of them keep on going at it. That's roughly about 20% of the people. One person mentioned how they interact with that the honorifics of Hyung and Nuna, he keeps those, especially as a term of endearment. And I realized I do the same thing myself. Now, I have many Johannas in my life, but there's only one Johanna Nuna, and that's the one from GPA. So it seems that language is used to transport people back in time as a reminiscence about their time spent in the van, and it's sort of a way of identifying themselves to a certain subculture, you would say. Even those who did the program before and after me, there is a certain bond that occurs when we use a similar lingo. Now, all these experiences and linguistic differences affirms that a language plays an integral part of how we bond with each other. I recently went to a wedding not so long ago. It was for a friend, and this friend is one who did the same gap year program I did at the exact same time. And I saw lots of former members of the gap year program as well, lots of the same members of GPA. And I found that I could talk with them and we could converse with each other using that language, that terminologies that's only specific to GPA. And we could communicate with each other, almost as if we were old friends. Despite this would be our first time meeting each other. This was an exclusive language. Not everyone can really understand the impact of when you're done with the time fundraising and then you hear your captain say, it's time to go blitzing. It's hard to understand the impact of certain words. You know, me and my friends, we can joke about blitzing and how horrendous hearing that was. We could talk about breaking 1,000 or reaching new PRs, or our favorite areas to fundraise to, or talking about our favorite memories during blitzing and some of our least favorite memories too. And all those things can hit differently because we all live through it and we use a language to express that. And just that bubble of a language is enough to create something very special between each and every one of us. And I'm sure that's something that each of us has. Maybe from high school or university you meet back with your old friends and you realize there's certain terminology that you use that you're no longer used to. And when we use certain terminologies, a new wash of memories come by. It makes us realize what kind of lives we live, what kind of identities we hold, and how we express that through the words that we use. And for me, GPA has been that place, and these specific terminologies have been used to express such feelings. Overall, language has created a culture. No matter where it's from top-heavy down approach, because that can be impacted, or from bottom up, as I've seen that happen too. But the language that comes out of it, the terminology, it fulfills a special purpose.
Pounds first.
So make a wish.
Okay.
Yeah. So imagine candles, 19 candles,
Okay.
burning brightly.